Sexual harassment and assault have unfortunately always been a feature of human societies, but it was not until the Me Too movement began in 2017 that people became especially aware of these issues. Though the Me Too movement likely had some positive effects, like empowering women to speak out against sexual injustices, there was the potential, as with all movements, for the pendulum to swing too far. To understand the importance of this topic, consider this real-world story of Jay Cheshire and his mother. In 2015, Jay, a 17-year-old student, was accused of a rape that he denied. He found it difficult to cope with the ensuing intense police investigation. The complainant withdrew the allegation 2 weeks later, and the investigation was closed. However, even though Jay was acquitted, the damage had already been done. Jay was described as absolutely distraught, had completely spiraled, and was a shell of a person with his soul ripped away. 2 weeks after the charges were dropped, Jay bought his favorite energy drink, favorite bag of chips, and a rope. Then he was found by a dog walker hanging from a tree in a park near his home that he and his sister used to play on when they were younger. Jay's mother described herself as helpless, struggling, and raw, became more isolated and disengaged, and was hospitalized 5 times over a 6-month period. Leading up to the anniversary of Jay's death, Jay's mother appeared vacant and zombie-like. Shortly after the anniversary, Jay's mother hung herself using the same rope that Jay used to hang himself. This tragic story is just one example of what can happen to someone and their family when someone is falsely accused of sexual assault. Here are some other examples. James was going through a divorce, and when his wife was losing the case to have custody of their children, she alleged James raped her multiple times during their marriage. James was arrested and later lost custody of his children, his job, and was on the brink of suicide. Though the charges against James were dropped within a year, he had endured much suffering. James said, "Do not underestimate how awful this feels. The suicidal thoughts are pervasive." Chris, another man falsely accused of sexual assault, stated, "It is such a stigmatized accusation that it doesn't feel as if you're innocent before being proven guilty, but the other way around. I am tarnished, shamed, and alienated. I am humiliated amongst my community." You may work with a client like Jay, James, or Chris in the future, so understanding false allegations of sexual misconduct is important. First, some definitions. Sexual assault is defined as any non-consensual act, including when the victim lacks capacity to consent. Sexual harassment in the context of employment can be defined as unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature that is so frequent or severe that it creates a hostile or offensive work environment. Some people include offensive remarks about a person's sex as sexual harassment, and I will explore this issue later. Finally, sexual misconduct can be defined as a broad term encompassing any unwelcome behavior of a sexual nature that is committed without consent or by force, intimidation, coercion, or manipulation. So it's a broad term that encompasses both sexual assault and harassment and other categories. I think it's also important to understand the context of false allegations of sexual misconduct. Sexual harassment and assault have unfortunately always been a feature of human societies, but it was not until the Me Too movement began in 2017 that people became especially aware of these issues. Though the Me Too movement likely had some positive effects, like empowering women to speak out against sexual injustices, there was the potential, as with all movements, for the pendulum to swing too far. At best, the increased awareness probably led to increased hypervigilance or preoccupation with sexual harassment or assault, such that people may become biased and conclude there is sexual harassment or assault without sufficient evidence. At worst, there will be bad actors who will take advantage of the current zeitgeist and these biases to weaponize sexual harassment and assault claims and make false claims to further their own ends. In these ways, it is reasonable to wonder if the Me Too movement has led to an increase in false allegations of sexual assault or harassment toward men. These biases against men are likely to be supported by an expanding academic definition of sexual harassment that serves to artificially increase prevalence estimates of sexual harassment by men toward women. Consider the US Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's task force found huge variance in the rate of women reporting sexual harassment in the workplace. Using random representative samples, they found that 25% of women reported having experienced sexual harassment if they were simply asked if they had experienced sexual harassment, compared to a rate of 60% when women were asked if they experienced specific behaviors that the researchers defined as sexual harassment. This suggests the academic definition of sexual harassment as a set of behaviors is very different from the way ordinary people define sexual harassment. In fact, the task force found that researchers have concluded that many individuals do not label certain forms of unwelcome sexually based behaviors, even if they view them as problematic or offensive, as sexual harassment. If we look at the most widely used sexual harassment measure, the Sexual Experiences Questionnaire or SEQ, we see that it defines sexual harassment as three subtypes of behaviors: unwanted sexual attention, sexual coercion, and gender harassment. This last subtype of gender harassment means gender-related hostile behaviors that are devoid of sexual interest, including sexist or crude or offensive behavior. And it is also the most commonly endorsed component of the SEQ, even though it has the lowest correlation with a single global item that simply asks women if they've ever experienced sexual harassment, with a correlation coefficient of 0.15. In other words, non-sexual gender harassment is the most commonly reported sexual harassment behavior as defined by academics, and yet it shares little overlap with whether people actually think they have experienced sexual harassment. This may be an example of concept creep, where the meaning of sexual harassment has been expanded by academics to encompass a wider range of behaviors. To illustrate this concept creep, we can look at last year's Me Too report. The left figure shows the prevalence of sexual harassment and assault behaviors as defined by these academics and reported by women in the past year. It is clear the category of verbal sexual harassment is by far the most frequently reported behavior that constitutes what these academics deem sexual harassment. If we look at the items they use to measure verbal sexual harassment, we see non-sexual gender harassment items like someone calling you a sexist slur, someone purposely misgendering you or calling you a homophobic or transphobic slur. So this is just my personal guess, but I think if you were to ask the average person on the street whether misgendering or sexist, homophobic, or transphobic slurs constitute sexual harassment, I'm going to think that most people would say no. Um, Other verbal sexual harassment items like someone whistling or honking at you, someone saying things like "hey baby" to you, may be considered sexual harassment by some, but others may just as easily consider these to be obnoxious or rude behaviors rather than sexual harassment per se, while reserving the category of sexual harassment for more serious behaviors that have a more significant impact, like someone making threats against you unless you date them. Therefore, the concept of sexual harassment has arguably expanded, which has led to prevalence estimates that likely bias us to see sexual harassment as more prevalent than it really is, which in turn may bias us to be less likely to believe a man who tells us they have been falsely accused of sexual harassment.